Hello class, welcome to this lecture on Existentialism, Loving Playfulness, and Play-Ontology in María Lugones and Eugen Fink. Let's start first with Lugones' serious or playful path. María Lugones is an Argentinian-born feminist philosopher, activist, and was associate professor of comparative literature of women's studies until she passed away very recently. In her later work, she developed the idea of the coloniality of gender, and in her earlier work, she pursued the idea that the recognition of plurality involves conceptualizing yourself and others in a world not your own. In her 2003 book, Pilgrimage, included the essay we'll be studying this week, Playfulness, World Traveling, and Loving Perception. Why study Lugones in an existentialism class? Well, for our purposes, her essay accomplishes two main things. She solves the serious existential problem of how, when, and why to apologize to your mother, and she also gives us a practical yet playful attempt to make existential accounts of being in the world, being at ease, recognitional solidarity, Hegel, Heidegger, Gadamer, de Beauvoir all being on the horizon here, more relevant and accessible to our everyday lives. The essay also productively inaugurates the fruitful intersection of contemporary Latina feminism and European existentialism phenomenology, and thus drawing inspiration especially from María Lugones and also Gloria Anzaldúa, who we're covering this week in another video, Mariana Ortega, who we'll cover more next week, goes on to write in between Latina feminist phenomenology, multiplicity in the self. Lugones begins her seminal essay, Playfulness, World Traveling, and Loving Perception, with two things coming together. That is her coming to consciousness as a daughter and coming to consciousness as a woman of color. What her concept of world traveling provides is a solution to the quandary of alienation that is often felt when we travel to others' worlds. At home, we are willful and playful, but as outsiders, we must practice world traveling as a matter of necessity. To do so is in fact far from losing ourselves, but rather requires a skillful, creative, rich, and enriching practice. When the world traveler encounters hostility, such as racial hostility, this devalues the complex skill set involved. What Lugones recommends is that we affirm traveling across worlds as partly constitutive of cross-cultural and cross-racial loving. What the essay aims to open up is the possibility and complexity of a pluralistic feminism. In order to do that, we must provide a solution to the problem of the outsider versus the one at home, since identity is always constructed around this binary. Rather than valorize the being in itself, the smooth or essential ease of feeling at home in the world, and making the other meet one in one's own world, Lugones will underline the phenomena of world traveling as both an ethics and a matter of necessity, especially for outsiders within a dominant culture. This world traveling is indeed valorized in Lugones as a skillful, creative, rich, and enriching practice. However, the world traveler often encounters hostility. When this occurs, it can seem like the world traveling itself is pointless, and the complex skill set it involves becomes devalued. All that matters once again becoming us versus them, my world versus the world of the others. What Lugones recommends is traveling across worlds as constitutive of cross-cultural and cross-racial love, and thus the main target of the essay is that phenomena of hostility and world exclusion which shuts down the phenomena of world travel. This occurs by and large on account of arrogant perception. Marilyn Frye defines arrogant perception as a failure to properly identify persons that one views arrogantly. For Lugones, this failure to identify and to identify with is a failure of love. Only when we playfully deconstruct the connection between arrogant perception on the one hand and unconditional servitude on the other will we have attained to loving perception. By framing the main impediment to respectful world travel as arrogant perception, Lugones is also attempting to short-circuit Hegel's concept of recognition and the master-slave dialectic. For Hegel, we cannot become who we are unless we are recognized, but the slave is never recognized by the master and comes to see him or herself in terms of the master's arrogant perceptions. If we short-circuit arrogant perception, then we deprive the master of his recognition as master by the slave, as well as depriving the slave of his recognition of himself as slave, as well as depriving the slave. Loving perception indeed transcends the dialectics of recognition. although arrogant perception reinforces it. In wanting to be done with arrogant perception, Lugones thus wishes to short-circuit Hegel's account of the dialectic. Her concept to accomplish this will be play. Having only lightly touched on some of the theoretical intentions in the essay, Lugones quickly pivots to some more personal confessions. As a child, she writes, I was taught to perceive arrogantly, and I have also been a victim of arrogant perception. Though I am not a white Anglo woman, it is clear to me that I can understand both my childhood training as an arrogant perceiver and my having been the object of arrogant perception without any reference to white Anglo men. I was brought up in Argentina watching men and women of moderate and of considerable means graft the substance of their servants to themselves. I also learned to graft my mother's substance to my own. In other words, Lugones grew up in worlds where arrogant perception was systematically organized to break the spirit of all women and of most men. What this essay attempts is to declare war, although playfully and tactfully, against arrogant perception, including women's own arrogant perceptions of each other. The essay is motivated by two observed failures and a possible solution to both. One, Lugones' own failure to love her mother non-abusively, despite actually loving her and identifying with her. And two, what she perceived on her move to the US to be white Anglo women's failure to love women across racial and cultural boundaries, insofar as they are taught not to identify with them. Indeed, when Lugones moved to the US, she learned that I could be seen as a being to be used by white Anglo men and women without the possibility of identification, i.e., they might graft her substance onto them without noticing it at all and without her and her world rubbing off on them in any way. What Lugones is attempting to understand is how her own abusive relationship with her mother and failure to identify with her unfolds the same structure of arrogant perception as the way she was treated by white Anglo women in the US. Lugones can thus identify with these white Anglo women due to her own failure in her childhood in Argentina to love servants, who she herself used at that time without identifying with them. Her solutions to 1 and 2 are the same. In order to overcome arrogant perception and to identify lovingly across generational, racial, cultural, and social boundaries, what is needed above all is to practice playfulness, world traveling, and loving perception. These were actually hard-won realizations for Lugones, who considered herself a very serious person, pondering the crucial importance of playfulness in all world traveling and identification. She became very insecure and called her friends to ask, "Am I playful?" Her friends usually said, "Of course you are." People who only know you in contexts in which you don't feel playful might say, "No, you're a serious woman." At this point, Lugones knows that she is playful in certain contexts, and she uses this anecdote to explore phenomenologically why it is that she can be perceived as a serious or a playful woman depending on them. What she discovers is that being at ease in the world is a necessary condition to feel playful. Here, Lugones turns to the very concept of the world. What is a world? What is my world? What is your world? Why is it that we are at ease in some worlds and not in others, playful and feeling like ourselves in some and not in others? Much like Heidegger, by world, Lugones does not mean the fixity of the totality of beings, nor does she mean some utopian, merely inner world inhabited by imaginary people. I.e., the world is not the objective totality of existent things, nor is it the solipsistic fantasy that everyone merely has their own world, and that for every individual, every other world is a back world, every other person an imaginary one. No, what Lugones means by world is a world inhabited, at present, by some flesh and blood people. We are not only inner-worldly beings, but also interworldly beings. And this interworldliness can also include cultural constructions of race, class, and gender. Furthermore, world seldom means society as a whole, but almost always groups within a society, i.e., the concept of a world community is almost so vast as to be meaningless. The next question she asks is, what does it mean to inhabit a Hispanic world? Well, in the US, it means to be a recognizable group and somewhat outside the dominant Anglo construction. For example, my father is Argentinian and my mother is Irish, and so I was partly raised in the Hispanic world, but mostly raised in Canada. I don't exactly look Hispanic, although through my father's side of the family, being Hispanic is part of my identity. My Spanish being only barely passable, and the bulk of my interworldly community being non-Hispanic, I do not check the box Hispanic on equal opportunity forms. Despite having an Argentinian father and Hispanic roots, I do not belong to the recognizable group. These meditations lead to some curious questions. What is a Hispanic? Who counts as Hispanic? Again, from the point of view of equal opportunity forms, are Latinos, Chicanos, Hispanos, Black Dominicans, white Cubans, Korean Colombians, Italian Argentinians all Hispanic? Lugones notes here that the definition of Hispanic is incomplete. There is no one shoe fits all size. But even so, Lugones finds herself participating constantly in animating such a stereotypical construction. She is perceived as Hispanic. She participates in Hispanic worlds. The onus becomes on her in an almost Aristotelian sense to figure out what the genera Hispanic is all about. Such a construction of the genera Hispanic, however, is only possible on the basis of traveling between many worlds, that is, many peoples who count as Hispanic. Indeed, for Lugones, worlds are not only factically given, as in mainstream existentialism and phenomenology, but properly constructed. Upon moving to the US, Lugones found herself in a world that constructed her as stereotypically Latin. However, being stereotypically Latin and simply being Latin are parts of different worlds. Those of us who are world travelers have the distinct experience of being very different in different worlds, as well as having the capacity to remember other worlds and how we were within them. In fact, we ourselves experience being different people within different worlds. Identity in this way is not fixed, but actually changes through world traveling. And we might say, I feel more playful in one world than another. The world in which she feels most playful is, for Lugones, the one in which she is most herself. And so she turns to her definition of travel, which does not mean a change in physical space so much as a change in psychic space. The shift from being one person to being a different person is what I call travel. It is not the same person who psychically travels in this way. Rather, it is a shift from being one person to oneself being another person that is called travel. Such a shift may be willful and conscious, or simply a matter of habit. And the more we learn to enact these shifts between different worlds, the better traveled we become. Next, within the different worlds we travel to, there are different ways of being at ease in the world. We are never maximally at ease in any given world. In fact, maximum being at ease in the world is dangerous, because it tends to produce people who have little inclination for world travel. If we wish to become familiar with the different ways of being at ease in our world, then we must learn 4 things. First, being a fluent speaker in a world, that is, knowing the terms, the words, the moves, being confident. 2, being normatively happy in a world. I like this world. Its norms align with my values. 3, there is being humanly bonded with people you love, who love you, who are not hostile. Without the human bonds of love and a minimum of hostility, it is very difficult to be at ease in a world. And lastly, when we are at ease in the world, we very often share a history, especially a daily history. And this sort of bonding often occurs even between those who are not humanly bonded in physical space, but who nevertheless share a world. These are the 4 ways of being at ease in a world. And they often intersect and often diverge. To the degree that they intersect, we may say, this is my world. That is due to our increased sense of agency and sense of self in that world. To the degree that they diverge, we may disown a world that we experience as domineering, that is willed by others, not by the self. Worlds that continually create difficulties in our performing actions become disowned worlds. Now for Lugones, it's almost like a law that you tend to be more playful in your world, but not playful at all in disowned worlds. Very often, worlds don't only converge and diverge into owned and disowned worlds, but rather what we are faced with are ambiguous worlds. And in these worlds, we experience a mixture of ease and unease, playfulness, and taciturnity. In the world in which you are unplayful, you are a different person than in the world in which you are. You can practice being more playful in other worlds, but it's not easy. And this describes the experience of outsiders. Why is belonging to a world a condition of possibility of playing within it? Because identity is constructed through memory and cultural differences. In fact, for Lugones, playfulness underlies the relationship of identity to ambiguity.
belong, we identify, and thus playfulness emerges in ambiguous situations.
What allows the play to be fun and part of a game is that it is, in at least some sense, part of a shared history of memory and of cultural difference. But this concept of identity between playfulness and ambiguity is easily caricatured by arrogant perception. If the others don't share your sense of identity, playfulness, and liminality, then they tend to hoity-toity upon it. And this creates a traumatic split in your own self-perception. You are, in fact, an ambiguous being, bearing different identities and internalized self-perceptions in different worlds. Fleeing from the scene of playful ambiguity, it comes to seem like you're not. Like you're just this one identity or one set of identities or another. That is never, in fact, the truth. However, faced with this paradox of resolving ambiguity, those who learn to world travel must learn to play the trickster or the fool. At first, the trickster or fool finds a way out of ambiguity and reestablishes easefulness in ambiguous worlds. And here Lugones gives the example of her playing into the stereotype of Latins being intense. Well, on the one hand, there's the stereotype, merely constructed by the Anglo world, that many Latins are intense. And on the other hand, many Latins are actually intense. This establishes yet another layer of ambiguity, for Lugones is both stereotypically intense in her identity as Latinic or Hispanic, and on the other hand, she is actually intense. This way, she may or may not choose to animate the stereotype, but when she behaves intensely as a Latina American, she animates it either way. And so she develops a playful aspect around her intensity, playing the fool or the trickster between stereotypical intensity and actual intensity. How fun and charming. Clearly, in Lugones' account, existential authenticity is never a one-off. We need the trickster or the fool, the liminal and ambiguity. Always straddle the margin between authenticity and inauthenticity. Without this liminality, we would have to become one thing or another, and thus would cease to travel between worlds. Now, traveling between worlds is not an Aristotelian end in itself. Other worlds are not wonderful simply by virtue of being other worlds. Rather, what we wish is to travel to healthy worlds, and for our own worlds and ambiguous states to be healthy. When we experience a lack of playfulness in a world, this can indeed lead to unhealthiness, both in our own world and in our relation to the other world. We all inhabit a plurality of worlds, but we are not at ease in worlds in which we are constructed by self and others as not playful. Surprisingly, it is not that we are not playful because we are not at ease. This is a common misunderstanding. I'm not comfortable, or I have anxiety, and that's why I can't be playful. In fact, we might very well not be at ease and still be playful. Lack of playfulness is in fact symptomatic of a lack of psychic health within particular worlds. And this may be the case for many of you GE students in the academic world. It's scary out there, believe me, but also exhilarating and playful if you learn the worlds in which you play well enough. For Lugones, the only antidote to world fear for the world traveler is a loving attitude. What Lugones herself is scared of is becoming an overly serious human being. Someone with no multidimensionality, with no fun in life, someone who has just had the fun constructed out of her. I am seriously scared of getting stuck in a world that constructs me that way. A world that I have no escape from and in which I cannot be playful. How to get out of this impasse and aporia? Playfulness within the loving attitude is key for all transition between worlds. And at this point, Lugones utilizes and at the same time critiques the fundamental concept of play in Huizinga and Gadamer. Huizinga, in fact, wrote the first and still one of the most influential books on play in 1938, Homo Ludens, Man the Player. And Hans-Georg Gadamer, a German philosopher and student of Heidegger's, wrote extensively on the concept of play in his famous book, The Foundation of Contemporary Hermeneutics, Truth and Method. Lugones discovers, to her amazement, that both were wrong about play. For both understand play in the first instance agonistically, that is, having to do with winning and losing and battling and the rules of the game. In agonistic play, competence is supreme, but some rules inspire hostility. Playfulness is conceived as derivative to play. You must know the rules of the game first, that is, of the plays, and only within them can one be playful. Unfortunately, this is a highly reductive reading of the concept of play in Homo Ludens and Truth and Method. Play does not, in fact, reduce to agonistic play in either Huizinga or Gadamer, but it's nevertheless provocative, so let's see where it goes. To introduce her notion of loving playfulness, Lugones speaks in a metaphor or allegory, which is ontologically very profound. Imagine this. We are by a riverbank. The river is low, very low, almost dry. Bits of water here and there, little pools with a few trout hiding under the rocks. But mostly is wet stones, gray on the outside. We walk by the stones for a while. You pick up a stone and crash it onto the others. As it breaks, it is quite wet inside, and it is very colorful, very pretty. I pick up a stone and break it and run towards the pieces to see the colors. They are beautiful. I laugh and bring the pieces back to you, and you are doing the same with your pieces. We keep on crashing stones for hours, anxious to see the new colors. We are playing. Yes, we are, and Lugones is also writing poetry. Lugones enjoys this allegory and plays it forth, and in it she embeds a critique of philosophers of play. Check out my toy! Isn't it cool and spherical? Do you want to see me smash it? To which you reply, check out my toy. In this case, an iron dendrite rock formation. Do you want to see how I play with it and potentially smash it? Lugones' point here is to mediate for us the potentially destructive consequences of play. The playfulness of our activity does not presuppose that there is something like crashing stones that is a particular form of play. Rather, the attitude that carries us through the activity, playful attitude, turns the activity into a play. This is the very notion of play understood prior to the concept of a game. Do we just play at being ourselves? Or might we actually become who we are? Do we just play at being in worlds? Or playfully, do we travel across worlds in their ambiguity? I've often been struck by Lugones' allegory here, in its resonance with Heidegger's care fable in Being and Time. This is the only mythical story that Heidegger included near to the end of the first division, in trying to grasp the meaning of existence or Dasein as care, Sorge. He cites the Roman schoolboy's notebook's Hyginus, which is the only source we have for the ancient care fable. And significantly, this story, like Lugones' fable, can be read as an allegory of play and playfulness. Here as well, the young goddess Care crosses an empty riverbed. Instead of picking up stones to be broken, she gathers clay and begins to mold it into the shape of a human being. At this point, the god Jove or Zeus arrives and grants the creature spiritus, breath, and insists that the creature thereby carry his name. While the two were arguing, Tellus, Earth, arose and wanted to have her name given because she had made her body available for it. A judgment is finally rendered by Saturn. Since the creature's spirit was granted by Jove, Jove should have the creature in death. Tellus or Earth would receive the body back that she had given, but because Kura or Care had been the creator, she would keep her creation as long as it lived. And to resolve the debate, Homo or human being would be the name given because it was made from humus, earth. The details between Lugones' riverbank and fable of play and Hyginus' myth of Care, playing in an empty riverbank and forming the human being from clay, only to have her play turned into the site of a world game and indeed world dispute between the gods, are strikingly similar. What is the connection between care, or what Lugones calls loving perception, and play? And how deep does it go into the relation of the human being to being? Now, this story attracted the attention of Heidegger, who observed a double sense of care in the care fable as referring to concern, Kura's concern for her offspring, and absorption in its world, as well as care in the sense of devotion, or what Lugones calls loving perception. Indeed, Heidegger regards the fable as a naive interpretation of the philosophical concept he calls Dasein as being in the world. And his use of the fable in casting the female Kura as the creator of human beings has been seen as an inversion of the equivalent Judeo-Christian myth in which woman is created last. The centrality of care in the becoming of the human is thus a challenge to the Western concept of self-sufficiency and the atomization of the individual. Heidegger as well will develop, on the basis of his understanding of Dasein as care, a comprehensive philosophy of play in lectures subsequent to Being in Time, but we won't cover those here. Rather, let's segue now to the more general connection between play and existence, or play existentialism, in the writings of one of Heidegger's most gifted students, Eugen Fink. A part of the introduction to this work, The Oasis of Happiness, was earlier translated by David Farrell Krell, but the complete manuscript of play as a symbol of the world and Fink's other writings on the concept of play were only translated more recently by Ian Alexander Moore and Christopher Turner. Eugen Fink was born in 1905 and died in 1975. By the age of 20, he was studying philosophy, history, German language, and economics, initially at Münster and Berlin, and then in Freiburg University under Edmund Husserl. He was initially Husserl's assistant and a representative of phenomenological idealism, but by 1929 he also became a follower of Heidegger, attending his 1929 lectures, The Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, and also later suggesting to Heidegger they're the best place to start in understanding his thought. In his own philosophy, Fink approached the problem of being as a manifestation of the cosmic movement, with man being a participant in this movement, that is, in terms of play. He writes in the opening of The Oasis of Happiness a summary of his overall philosophy of play. In our century that is plagued by the racket of machines, insight into the great significance of play within the structure of human existence is on the rise for the leading intellects of cultural criticism, the pioneers of modern pedagogy, and academics of anthropological disciplines. It permeates the self-consciousness of the contemporary human being to an astounding degree, a consciousness that is reflected in literature. Play is affirmed and cultivated as a vital impulse of independent worth with its own status. It is thought to be a remedy for the harms of a contemporary technocratic civilization, and it is extolled as a rejuvenating, life-renewing power, like a plunge back into a morning-fresh primordiality and plastic creativity. Certainly, there were times in human history that bore the mark of play more than our own. Times that were more cheerful, more relaxed, more playful, times that knew more leisure and had closer contact with the heavenly muses. But no age had more objective play possibilities and play opportunities than our own, because none had at its disposal so gigantic a life apparatus, so many toys. The question remains open as to whether our age has achieved a deeper and more compelling understanding of the essence of play, whether it has as its disposal a comprehensive perspective on the manifold manifestations of play, and whether it has adequate insight into the ontological sense, or Seinsinn, of the phenomena of play, and whether it knows philosophically what play and playing are. With this, we touch on the problem of an ontology of play. Having opened the project thus in this 1957 essay, Fink mentions the three main topics to be covered. 1, the preliminary characterization of the phenomena play. 2, the structural analysis of play. And 3, the question concerning the connection between play and being. On Play and Animal Worlds, he writes, "Doesn't the animal also play? Doesn't the surge of life's exuberance arise in the heart of every living creature? Biological research offers amazing descriptions of animal behavior that resembles human play in its mode of appearance and in the motor forms of its expression. But the critical question emerges as to whether that which appears similar in external form is also similar ontologically. I am not here contesting that a biological concept of the behavior of play can be established on good grounds, such that the human being and the animal appear related. Nevertheless, it is not yet decided which mode of being has in each case the similar looking behavior." Sounding very much like Heidegger, therefore, for Fink, the difference between animal and human play can only be plausibly resolved when the human being's ontological constitution and the animal's way of being are ontologically elucidated and determined beforehand. And this we still scarcely know how to do. In the usual sense, as a human activity, play is thought of more or less as a frivolous and pleasurable nonsense, as a carefree sojourn in the airy realm of fantasy and sheer potentialities, as an escape from unyielding reality into a dream utopia. For Fink, as long as we continue naively using the popular antithesis of work and play, frivolity and seriousness and the like, we will never grasp the ontological meaning of play. And here play becomes central to existentialism and existential analysis itself, for play is a basic existential phenomena, just as primordial and just as autonomous as death, love, work, the struggle for power, but it is not bound to these phenomena in an ultimate common purpose. Before we can articulate the ontology of play, we have to understand play in the way of our existence, and this is the existential analysis of play. Now, when we look at play as a mode of our way of being in the world, playing does not simply occur in our life like a vegetative process. It is always an occurrence that is luminously suffused with sense, full of sense, sinnhaft, as well as an enactment which is experienced. In the economy of managing our lives, we alternate between tension and relaxation, between business and diversion. We follow the well-known prescription of hard weeks and joyous feasts. But should play loosen up only a mental tension from which the contemporary human being with his immense life apparatus suffers? As long as, in such trains of thought, one still naively operates within the popular antitheses of work and play and the seriousness of life, and so forth, play is not understood in the content and depth of its being. Now, for Fink, there are three dimensions of play. 1, our self-relation in play. 2, our understanding of being in play. And 3, our openness to the world in play. The human being is essentially a mortal being, essentially a worker, essentially a fighter, a lover, and also essentially a player. Death, work, ruling, love, and play form the elementary structure of tension and the outline of the puzzling and polysemous character of human existence. This truth was well known to Friedrich Schiller when he said, "Man is only fully man when he plays." And such statements are valid also in regards to work, struggle, death, and love. In other words, a whole philosophical ontology could be built upon the existential dimension and its existential analysis. For only a living being which in its being has this very being as an issue, as Heidegger taught, can die, work, struggle, love, and play. At first, perhaps these other fundamental phenomena seem to be clearer to us in regards to the threefold of self-relation, understanding of being, and openness to the world. But play as well traverses these three dimensions. We must begin to discuss what Schiller had called the play drive in terms of the gigantic passion that drives man to attempt the interpretation of his existence from out of the passion of his spirit. Herein lies the source of our greatness and also our wretchedness. The subsistence of no other living being is disturbed in such a way that it would ask about the obscure sense of its Dasein. For Fink, echoing Heidegger here, the animal cannot and God need not ask about itself. Every human answer to the question of the sense of life entails the positing of a final end, and such final ends have been quite readily positable in the phenomena of death, work, ruling, and love. What is distinctive about play and conspicuously sets it apart from the other fundamental phenomena is that it seems to have no final end, to involve no teleological perspective on life and the world, and is not concerned, like the other phenomena, with the whole futural character of life. Play alone among the fundamental phenomena offers us timeless presence and immanent purposiveness, and so Fink underlines, in contrast with the restless dynamism, the obscure ambiguity and relentless futurism of our lives, play is characterized by calm, timeless presence and autonomous, self-sufficient meaning. What it resembles is an oasis of happiness, or eudaimonia, that we happen upon in the desert of our Tantalus-like seeking and pursuit of happiness. It is not, however, as is frequently said, that play is purposeless or undirected activity. Rather, considered as a whole, it is purposive, and each individual phase of play action has its own specific purpose, which is an integral part of the whole, the movement of play. What is distinctive is that the immanent purpose of play is not subordinate to the ultimate purpose served by all other human activity or praxis. And in this way, play can serve as an ontological model or symbol of the pure event. For it is in the autonomy of play action that there appears a possibility of human timelessness in time. Time is then experienced not as a precipitate rush of successive moments, but rather as the one full moment that is a glimpse of eternity. And play in this way is associated with the God that is always young, or the child who plays, concerning which the poet Rainer Maria Rilke declares, "O hours of childhood, when behind each shape more than the past appeared, and what streamed out before us was not the future. We felt our bodies growing and were at times impatient to be grown up, half for the sake of those with nothing left but their grown-upness. Yet were, when playing by ourselves, enchanted with what alone endures, and we would stand there in the infinite blissful space between the world and the toy, at a point which, from the earliest beginning, had been established for a pure event. Concluding the first section of his essay, Fink writes, "If one defines play, as is usually done, only in opposition to work, actuality, seriousness, and genuineness, one merely places it falsely next to the other phenomena of life. But play is a fundamental phenomena of human existence, just as primordial and independent as the others, but not directed, like the others, by a collective striving for a final purpose. Play stands over and against them, as it were, in order to assimilate them to itself by portraying them. And thus we play at seriousness, play at genuineness, play at actuality. We play work and struggle, play love and death, and we even play itself." The next topic to be covered is the relation between play and playfulness as an attunement. If play is pleasurably attuned, joyfully moved in itself, it becomes animated. If these stimulating joys of play are extinguished, the activity of play dwindles straight away. This pleasure in play is a strange pleasure that is difficult to grasp, one that is neither merely sensuous nor merely intellectual. And here Schiller was right in distinguishing the play drive from the sense drive and the form drive. Play, in superdistinction to these, is creative, formative bliss of its own kind, and is in and of itself polysemous and multidimensional. Play can incorporate deep sorrow and abysmal grief, and it can even pleasurably engulf what is horrible. It is not only distance from the greatest moments of bitterness in life that makes their pain pass away. Rather, it is a restoration of psychic health, and playfulness transforms bitterness into a pleasurable experience. Now, on the sense and structure of play, Fink writes, "The pleasure of play involves taking delight in a sphere that is an imaginary dimension, and it is not merely pleasure at the play, but at taking pleasure in the play." It is now necessary to single out the sense of play as a further aspect in the structure of play. What is play? What do we mean when we use the term play? Fink defines play as an embodied attunement and as signification at the same time. It is playfulness and also a playing forth of being, and thus an existential phenomena of human life, that is, a sphere of being in the world within which the meaning of existence itself becomes clearer. If embodied attunement and signification at once is the basic sense of play, the first element of its basic structure is interplay, that is, playing with one another, which is an intimate form of human community. Next, on the structure of play, playing is not limitlessly free, cannot play at all without something binding being determined and adopted. Even in Lugones' fable of play without rules of the game, there is still the minimum sense of rules, of a back and forth, between the players revealing the glittering and colorful insides of the rocks in a playful attitude. According to Fink, the rules of play are not, however, laws. What binds us to the rules of the game in play does not have the character of something unalterable. Even in the middle of a game, we can change the rules with our fellow players' consent. Structural interplaying is what is primary for the constitution of the rules of the game. But then it is precisely the changed rule that counts and that binds the flow of reciprocal activities. Having discussed play attunement, the play community, the rules of play, Fink now addresses the play thing and the play world. Noting that the doll is considered to be a product of the toy industry, it is a piece of material and wire or a mass of plastic and can be acquired for purchase at a determined price. It is a commodity. But seen from the perspective of a playing girl, the doll is not a mere plaything, but rather a child, and the girl its mother. Beyond being merely a commodity or token, the plaything is also enworlded. The plaything's character of being a plaything, that is, its essence, lies not in its thingly character or function as a commodity, but rather in its magical character. It is a thing within simple actuality and at the same time has another mysterious reality. And in this way, as all children know, every genuine plaything becomes a proxy for all things in general, a miniaturization of worldly relations as a whole. Now, in order to play with the plaything in a play world, what is needed is the imaginary. And here there exists a very peculiar although in no way pathological schizophrenia or fundamental splitting of the human being. The child who plays, who enters into a game, performs in the actual world in a certain kind of activity that is well known in its features. But within the internal context of the sense of play, he takes on a role that is supported by the imaginary in play. And this is what constructs the play world. All structural aspects touched on until now come together in the most fundamental concept, the play world. Every sort of playing is a magical production of a play world. In the play world lies the role of the one playing, the changing roles of the community of play, the binding nature of the rules of play, and the significance of the plaything. The play world is itself an imaginary dimension whose ontological sense poses an obscure and difficult problem. We are so used to just dismissing the play world as unreal that it seldom occurs to us to ask after the character of its being. When we do so, we discover not only the imaginary, but the genesis of human freedom. We play in the so-called real world, but while playing, there emerges an enigmatic realm that is not nothing and yet is nothing real. Human play is a pleasurably attuned production of an imaginary play world. It is a wondrous joy in appearance, and play is always also characterized by the aspect of portrayal. The player feels as if he were a master of his imaginary products, but it remains a difficult question whether the nature of play must be grasped fundamentally and exclusively from the power of freedom that belongs to existence, or whether completely different grounds of existence reveal themselves and are at work in play as well. Play is not all pleasurable attunement, and although it can contain within itself the bright Apollonian aspect of free selfhood, it also has the dark Dionysian aspect of panic-stricken self-abandon. So in the course of playing and the embodied attunement and significance of the play world, human imagination oscillate between two extremes. On the one end, free vision, and on the other, entrancement. As Fink puts it, in the course of play, man can realize two extreme modes of being. One, Apollonian play, and two, Dionysian play. In Apollonian play, play can be experienced as a pinnacle of human sovereignty, and man enjoys here almost a limitless creativity. He is productive and uninhibited because he is not creating within the sphere of reality. The player experiences himself as the lord of the products of his imagination. And because imagination is virtually unlimited, play is an eminent manifestation of human freedom. But on the other hand, we do find occasionally in play the opposite pole of freedom, namely a withdrawal from the real world which can go so far as enchantment and trance and reach a point of total enslavement through the demonic power of the mask. This is scary, liminal, uncanny, or demonic play. So play itself is ambiguous and not just a mediating faculty between identity and ambiguity as in Lugones. In Fink's words, the relation of the human being to the enigmatic appearance of the play world and its imaginary is ambiguous. And we never understand play merely through the cognitive resources of a dialectic that levels out paradox. In fact, great philosophy has always recognized the eminent essentiality of play. It is only inauthentic everydayness that fails to recognize play, considers it something idle, neither serious nor genuine or actual. For example, Hegel says that play, because of its disinterestedness and superlatively light-hearted nature, is the most sublime and only true form of seriousness. And Nietzsche says in Ecce Homo, I know of no other way of coping with great tasks than play. For Fink, the question bequeathed upon us by earlier philosophies of play is whether the human being as player stays within the human realm or at the same time necessarily comports himself to a realm beyond the human, an übermenschlichen realm. The problem here is to analyze exactly the way in which reality and irreality combine and interpenetrate in human play. And to further work out this interpenetration, we can begin by noting that in the magical mirror image produced by the play world, any single object chosen at random can become a symbol. Play is thus symbolic and the image of a world in which reality and irreality can combine. When we look to the anthropological history of play, Fink notes that the earliest games of humanity were magical rites. The great gestures of cult, in which the archaic human being interprets his inner standing within the context of the world and portrays his fate and brings to presence the events of birth and death, weddings, war, hunting, and work. From the dawn of the human species, we must assume play is primordially the strongest binding power. It is community founding, although the community it founds is different than that of the departed versus the living, or of rule or the elementary family. The early human community of play embraces all these forms and shapes of being together, Miteinanderseins, and brings the whole of existence to complete presence. It consolidates the circle of the phenomena of life as the play community of the festival. So from out of the play instinct or drive, we are led already in human prehistory to the notion of the festival. The Archaic Festival for Fink is more than a mere merrymaking of the people. It is the elevated actuality, the actuality that has been elevated to the magical dimension of human life in all its relations. And here, the play of the festival is defined by that which it plays forth and celebrates. Here now, drawing closer to the cultic dramatic play and the festival of the Greeks, Fink writes, "It is the cultic dramatic play or spectacle, the Schauspiel, where the human being feels the nearness of the gods, the heroes, and the dead, and knows himself as having been placed into the presence of all the blessing and frightening powers of the world totality." And thus primeval play also has a deep connection with religion and its origins. The community of the festival envelops the spectators, the initiates and epops of a cultic play, where the deeds and sufferings of gods and humans appear on the stage, whose boards in fact signify the world. Here, on the theatrical stage of ancient drama, play becomes a poiesis, or making with and of appearances, creative bringing forth of production, poiesis. And its product is the play world, as a sphere of appearance, a field whose actuality is obviously not a very settled matter. This appearance of the play world through poiesis is obviously not nothing. The play world is something we move about in while we play and live in, and it's sometimes a light and airy dream world, and at other times full of ardent devotion and immersion. Indeed, the appearances of the play world often have a stronger experiential reality and power of impression than the bulk of everyday things in their worn-out ordinariness. And here we come to the thorniest problem, for the play world is defined by both illusion and reality, these two terms being strictly distinguished in the philosophical tradition since Parmenides. In order to tackle the unity of illusion and reality in play, we must ask, what is the imaginary? Where is this strange appearance located? What is its status? Insight into the ontological nature of play depends, not least, on determining what the imaginary really is. And this leads to a further question. What kind of appearance is the play world? A mere foreground of things? A deceptive representation? Phantasm in the soul? No one would want to dispute that in every instance of play, fantasy is at work and runs free. But are play worlds merely constructs of fantasy? No, for the play world contains subjective elements of fantasy as well as objective ontic elements. We are acquainted with the imagination as a faculty of the soul. We are acquainted with dreams, inner intuitions, the colorful contents of fantasy. But what is an objective and ontic appearance within play supposed to mean? The problem of analyzing exactly the way in which reality and irreality combine and interpenetrate in human play is of the utmost relevance and yet extremely difficult. The ontological analysis of play leads back to the cardinal problems of philosophy, speculations about being and nothingness, appearance and becoming. Our usual attitude towards the irreality of play is superficial. We must investigate the universal meaning of the imaginary dimension. And here we come up against the Platonic doctrine of being. Again and again instantiates a model of reality versus reproduction and shadows, one in which human life and this world mirrors the inner structure of the world itself, or ideas. Plato himself often understood the play of the sensuous world in precisely this way, that is, as a symbolic speculum for being itself, and even a precognition of the forms. Speaking more generally now about the meaning of existence in play, Fink writes that playing is finite creativity within the magical dimension of appearance. In the history of philosophy, thinkers have not only attempted to define the ontological character of play, Some have also dared to turn the problem around and define the meaning of existence itself through play. And this Fink calls the speculative concept of play. Play indeed becoming a conceptual formula for the world, wherein one part of the world, that is the sense and structure of the play world, becomes a model for the whole. Philosophers have used many such models or metaphors to describe the world as a whole or being itself. For Thales, it was water; for Plato, light and the forms; for Hegel, spirit, and so forth. The illuminating power of all such models for understanding being and the totality does not depend on a respective thinker's discretion in his selection. Rather, it depends on whether in fact the whole of being repeatedly mirrors itself of its own accord in a single being and realm of phenomena. For Fink, wherever the cosmos metaphorically repeats its constitution, its structure and layout in an inner worldly thing, a key philosophical phenomena is thereby indicated, from which a speculative world formula can be developed. And thus it is indeed possible to speak of an ontology rooted in the phenomena of play. Play is such an ontological phenomena that by its very nature it's endowed with the character of symbolic representation. Is this to say that play can become the symbolic theatrical enactment of the universe, the speculative metaphor of the world? This audacious, bold thought has actually been thought before. In the dawn of European philosophy, Heraclitus poses the aphorism, "The course of the world is a playing child, moving pieces on a board. A king's power belongs to the child." And after 25 centuries of the history of thought, there is Nietzsche, who writes, "In this world only play as artists and children engage it, exhibits coming to be and passing away, structuring and destroying, without any moral additive, in forever equal innocence. The world is the play of Zeus." And so, according to Fink, the symbolic essence of being itself is accessible in the play of the world. If the essence of the world is thought as play, it follows for the human being that he is the only being in this vast universe who is able to correspond to the prevailing whole. Fink here, again displaying his Heidegger-influenced anthropocentrism. Only in the correspondence to what is beyond the human may the human being then attain his native essence. And so, concluding his introductory essay again by quoting Rainer Maria Rilke, Fink notes how to the playful openness of human existence, to the playing ground of the being of all beings, the poet attests in this playful fragment from Rilke's uncollected poems. As long as you catch self-thrown things, it's all dexterity and venial gain. Only when you suddenly caught that ball which she, one of the eternal players, has tossed towards you, your center, with a throne precisely judged, one of those arches that exist in God's great bridge system, only then is catching a proficiency, not yours, a world's. And if you then had strength and courage to return the throw, no, more wonderful, forgot strength and courage and had already thrown, as the year throws the birds, those migrating bird swarms, which an older to a younger warmth sends catapulting across oceans, only in that venture would you truly join in. No longer making the throw easy, no longer making it hard, out of your hands the meteor would launch itself and flame into its spaces. The last words of Fink's piece. When thinkers and poets point in such a humanly profound way to the immense significance of play, we should also be mindful of the saying, we cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven if we do not become as children. So that being our digression into Fink's oasis of happiness and the ontology of play, or play existentialism, let's return now to Lugones and the conclusion of her article. For Lugones, the key opposition is agonistic play versus loving playfulness. And this is because the agonistic attitude can be inimical to traveling across worlds. The agonistic traveler is a conqueror, an imperialist, and Huizinga indeed diagnoses Western civilization as this sort of agonistic play. It has led to the assimilation of other people's worlds into the Western game, the European hegemony. Loving playfulness, on the other hand, enables one to cross boundaries and redefine the rules of the game in each new world. And so loving playfulness is closer to the playfulness of care in Heidegger's Care Fable, and to the joining in the world game with its eternal players in Rilke's poem. In her conclusion, Lugones notes that there are worlds which we enter at our own risk, worlds that have agon, conquest, and arrogance as the main ingredient of their ethos. For example, any social media location where there are trolls. But there are worlds that we can travel to lovingly as well. Only when we have traveled to each other's worlds are we fully subjects to each other. And so Lugones agrees with Hegel's claim that self-recognition requires other subjects, but she disagrees with the claim that it requires or is inevitably forged in tension and hostility. The master-slave dialectic is simply not as inevitable in the development of self-conscious ethical life as we have been taught to believe. Loving perception simply refuses to play the game inaugurated by arrogant perception, and it emerges and takes hold in us when, traveling to other people's worlds, we discover that there are worlds in which those who are victims of arrogant perception are really subjects, lively beings, resistors, constructors of vision, even though in the mainstream construction they are animated only by the arrogant perceiver and are pliable, foldable, file-awayable, and classifiable. Lugones always imagines the Aristotelian slave as so pliable and foldable at night or after he or she cannot work anymore, when he or she dies as a tool. And here Aristotle as well tells us little about the slave apart from the master. We know of the slave in Western philosophy mostly only through the master. The slave is a tool of the master and a victim of arrogant rather than loving perception. As promised, Lugones' essay concludes by informing us when, how, and why to apologize to one's mother. Such apology becomes possible when we acquire new loving perceptions of our mothers. For Lugones, the mother was apparent to her mostly as a victim of arrogant perception, and in her childhood she was loyal to the arrogant perceiver's construction of her mother, and thus disloyal to her in assuming that she was exhausted by that construction. I was unwilling to be like her, and thought that identifying with her, seeing myself in her, necessitated that I become like her. I was wrong both in assuming that she was exhausted by the arrogant perceiver's construction of her and in my understanding of identification. I came to realize through traveling to her world that she is not exhausted by the mainstream Argentinian patriarchal construction of her. I came to realize there are worlds in which she shines as a creative being. And so Lugones concludes with an ethical imperative. 1. We should practice disloyalty to the arrogant perceivers in ourselves. And 2. Arrogant perception is incompatible with loving and loving perception. I hope you've enjoyed this overview on play existentialism, loving playfulness, and Play-Ontology in María Lugones and Eugen Fink. Next week, we'll be looking at Latinx in-betweenness and selfhood in Mariana Ortega, as well as the roots of Spanish existentialism in Jose Ortega y Gasset. See you then and have a good week.